Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Christina, Isana, and Leslie. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes heard nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's conclude our month of relaxing journeys with more from the Railway Traveler's Handy Book of hints, suggestions, and advice before the journey, on the journey, and after the journey. First published in 1862 by Lockwood & Co., Stationers' Hall Court, London. Let's pick up right where we left off with a new section on actually traveling on the train. Let's begin. On the journey. Settling down. The carriage and seat selected, all that has now to be done is to dispose yourself and your hand luggage as comfortably and conveniently as possible. Any traveling bags, hat cases, or small parcels which you take into the carriage with you, you will of course place beneath and above the seat, at the point where you are sitting. It need be scarcely suggested that these arrangements should be made so as to inconvenience your fellow passengers as little as possible. Stowing away hand luggage. In placing articles in the network above the seats of the first-class carriages, care should be taken to lodge them securely. Otherwise, the motion of the carriage is apt to shake them from their position. We were once traveling in a carriage opposite to a lady and gentleman, above whose heads was a large square bonnet box, a very small portion of which rested against the back of the carriage, and the remainder tilted over the edge in a most dangerous and threatening manner. After having our nerves excited to the very highest degree by the continual motion of the box and its imminent chance of falling, we took the liberty of calling the attention of the gentleman to it. But instead of expressing his thanks or remedying the defect, he tossed his head in a most offensive manner, as much as to say, "Impertinent fellow, mind your own business." Finding this to be the case, we removed our seat to another part of the carriage, and we had scarcely done so when down came the box upon the heads of those immediately beneath, the lady and gentleman sharing the damages between them. The bonnet which the lady had on her head was crushed and torn in such a manner as to render her quite a figure. As for the gentleman, we failed to catch sight of his expressive countenance for an interval of at least 2 minutes, inasmuch as the box had completely forced his hat over his eyes, nose, and chin, and he had to make use of frantic efforts to release his interesting features from their mask. And when he did succeed in freeing himself, his whole air was so woe-begone, and his hat so battered as to cause him to present a most woeful appearance. True, no blood was spilt, and no bones broken, but both lady and gentleman were terribly frightened, much shaken, and visited apparently with some affliction of the brain, which rendered them gloomy and cross for the remainder of the journey. Materials for comfort: rug, cap, and cushion. If the season be cold, you will of course be provided with a railway rug. Before sitting down, wrap this securely round your legs and sit upon it, so as to keep it in its place. A rug is certainly one of the greatest comforts of a railway traveler, and none should be without it. Not only does it keep the legs warm, but on emergencies it may be made to perform the part of a cloak, a counterpane, a cushion to sit upon, or a wrapper for fragile articles. When it is not required, it is very little in the way, and if neatly rolled up and confined by a strap, may be easily transported from place to place with the other luggage, without entailing much extra weight or bulk. Another mode of increasing the comfort of traveling is to have something to rest the feet upon, as a traveling bag, a small portmanteau, large parcel, etc. By this arrangement, not only is the draught from underneath the carriage door avoided, but the lower portion of the body is more rested by this elevation of the legs. When the journey is a long one and undertaken by night, great comfort will be found in a cap made to fit the head, and with lappets to draw over the ears. Having no projecting edges, the head may be thus leant back without pain to the head itself or injury to its covering. The cold night air is also effectually excluded, and those painful visitants known as toothache, earache, and face-ache receive their congé. If the carriage traveled in be a second or third class, the hardness of the seats may be considerably modified by the use of an air cushion, which when not in use is simply a roll of fabric, but when inflated for use has all the appearance and effectiveness of an ordinary cushion. A species of green or black spectacles, known as eye preservers, are excellent things for a railway traveler to carry with him, for if he be compelled to sit near the window and opposite to the engine, he will find that by wearing these, the eyes will be preserved from the dust and ashes, which are ever and anon intruding, and from the draughts of cold air which rush in at the window. A person in a railway carriage may be likened to a prisoner of state, who is permitted to indulge in any relaxation and amusement to while away the time, but is denied that essential ingredient to human happiness, personal liberty. He is, in fact, confined to a certain space for so many hours, and cannot well remove from his allotted durance without annoying his fellow passengers. The materials for railway amusement and relaxation embrace conversation, reading, card-playing, chess-playing, smoking, musing, and sleeping. Conversation. With regard to conversation, the English are notoriously deficient in this art. Generally speaking, the occupants of a railway carriage perform the whole of the journey in silence, but if one passenger be more loquaciously inclined than the rest, he is soon silenced by abrupt or tart replies, or by a species of grunt expressive of dissent or dissatisfaction. Sometimes a conversation is got up, but it is of a spasmodic and ephemeral nature, lasts for about the first 5 minutes of the journey, and then relapses into solemn silence, never again to be broken. This is most unnatural and unreasonable. Why should half a dozen persons, each with minds to think and tongues to express these thoughts, sit looking at each other mum chance, as though they were afraid of employing the faculty of speech? Why should an Englishman ever be like a ghost in not speaking until he is spoken to? Some fanciful philosophers have asserted that monkeys might speak if they chose, only they are fearful that if they did, they would be compelled to work. This is not an Englishman's case, for surely he works hard enough and has no penalty to escape. However, supposing Englishmen to so far forget themselves as to engage in conversation, let us insert a few words of advice on this head. Firstly, do not engage in discussions either political or theological. There is no knowing what tender chord may be touched, or what pain we may give to others in maintaining some pet theory or dogma. Besides, the utter inutility of all argument of this nature is notorious. Two men will argue for hours, each strong in his own opinion, and each bringing forward what he conceives to be irrefragable proofs of his soundness of doctrine. And yet, at the termination of the discussion, each disputant, in 99 cases out of 100, is not only unshaken in his opinion, but clings to it more firmly than if he had never heard the other side of the case put at all. Besides, in conducting arguments of this kind, there is sometimes danger of unwittingly working mischief to ourselves, which we may afterwards repent. Here is a case in point. Two gentlemen, sitting opposite each other in a railway carriage, get into political argument. One was elderly and a staunch conservative, the other was young and an ultra-radical. It may be readily conceived that as the argument went on, the abuse became fast and furious. All sorts of unpleasant phrases and epithets were bandied about. Personalities were freely indulged in, and the other passengers were absolutely compelled to interfere to prevent a fracas. At the end of the journey, the disputants parted in mutual disgust and looking unutterable things. It so happened that the young man had a letter of introduction to an influential person in the neighborhood respecting a legal appointment which was then vacant, which the young man desired to obtain, and which the elderly gentleman had the power to secure. The young petitioner, first going to his hotel and making himself presentable, sallied forth on his errand. He reached the noble mansion of the person to whom his letter of introduction was addressed, was ushered into an anteroom, and there awaited with mingled hope and fear the all-important interview. After a few minutes the door opened, and, oh horrible to relate, he who entered was the young man's traveling opponent, and thus the antagonists of an hour since stood face to face. The confusion and humiliation on the one side, and the hauteur and coldness on the other, may be readily imagined. Sir Edward C., however, for such he was, although he instantly recognized his recent antagonist, was too well bred to make any allusion to the transaction. He took the letter of introduction in silence, read it, folded it up, and returned it to the presenter with a bitter smile, and the following speech. "Sir, I am infinitely obliged to my friend for recommending to my notice a gentleman whom he conceives to be so well fitted for the vacant post as yourself. But permit me to say that inasmuch as the office you are desirous to fill exists upon a purely conservative tenure, and can only be appropriately administered by a person of conservative tendency, I could not think of doing such violence to your well-known political principles as to recommend you for the post in question. With these words and another smile more grim than before, Sir Edward C. bowed the chapfallen petitioner out, and he quickly took his way to the railway station, secretly vowing never again to enter into political argument with an unknown railway traveler. Another inappropriate theme of railway conversation is any accident that may chance to have occurred recently. But it is also observed that unless it is otherwise mutually desired, the acquaintance begotten in the railway carriage ceases with the journey, and although you may have conversed as freely with a person as though you had known him 20 years, you would not be justified in accosting him in the street subsequently. We insert this little item of railway etiquette because it may perchance prove useful, and without wishing to tire the reader, illustrate the position by the following incident. Lord B., a member of one of the oldest families of the aristocracy, and Mr. G., a London tradesman, happened to meet at the little island of Sark. The amusements of that remote and sea-girt place are few, and the number of visitors extremely limited. Thus these two men, although by birth, education, and habits totally opposed to each other, were drawn into the bonds of association from a species of necessity. They boated, they fished, and they shot together. They dined at the same table and took wine out of the same decanter. In short, for the whole period of their residence on the island, their several movements were a source of interest to each other, and they were seldom alone. When their time of stay was up, they traveled to London together, and at the terminus bade each other farewell. But poor G. was somewhat chagrined by his lordship's manner, which perceptibly cooled as they neared the metropolis, and although he pressed Lord B. over and over again to come and see him at his villa at Clapton, Lord B. neither responded to the invitation nor did he invite his quondam companion in return. Some months rolled on and the London season became at its height, when one day Mr. G., walking down Bond Street, espied on the opposite side of the way Lord B., coming along between two aristocratic-looking companions. Delighted at the idea of being able to show to the passers-by what a high-bred connection he could boast of, G. crossed over and familiarly accosted his lordship, proffering his hand, and making kind inquiries as to the state of his health. But Lord B., instead of appreciating these marks of friendship, drew himself up to his full height, and gazing intently through his glass, exclaimed, "Ah, to what happy circumstance am I indebted for the honor of your recognition? Really, I have not the pleasure of knowing you." "Not know me?" shouted the astonished and outraged London tradesman. "Why, surely, my lord, you cannot have forgotten the pleasant time you and I had of it at Sark last summer. My name is G. Oh, Mr. G. Sark, yes," responded his lordship. "Well, I have some faint recollection of something of the kind, and if ever we should meet at Sark again, I shall be happy to renew our acquaintance." So saying, his lordship bowed and passed on, leaving poor G. to reflections not very pleasant on the instability of human friendship in general, and that of noble lords in particular. Reading. Reading is an exhaustless fun of recreation. Ample provision is made on every bookstall along the line of literature in every variety of form, so that he who rails may read. It is always as well to provide oneself with a book or a newspaper, for if it is not used, you know you possess it, and can at any time fly to it by way of relief. It also forms an excellent weapon of defense against bores, that impertinent, intrusive, and inquisitive race, who can only be silenced by leveling a volume or a journal at their heads. If 2 or 3 persons in the same carriage purchase a newspaper, it is not a bad plan for each to select a different one, so that one may be exchanged for the other, and a variety of information obtained for the same outlay. In selecting a book for railway reading, care should be taken that the type is large and clear. Otherwise, the eyes are tried too severely to do them any good. When reading in a railway carriage, the printed lines are apt to present the curious appearance of running into one another, and utterly defeating all attempts at perusal. One of the best means of preventing this is to place a strip of card just 2 or 3 lines below the one which is being read, and gradually move it down the page as perusal progresses. Reading at night by the aid of the ordinary railway lamp is a task difficult if not impossible to accomplish. A lamp has been invented which obviates this difficulty. It is of small size, readily lighted, extinguished and trimmed, and furnished with a reflector which throws the light on the page. The lamp may of course be used for other than the special purpose for which it was constructed, and thus in more ways than one prove serviceable to the railway traveler. It has been asserted that reading when traveling by railway proves injurious to the sight, and so it may be, like everything else when carried to excess, and the reader will soon be warned of this by pain and weariness in the eyes. Certain it is that out of every train that starts of 200 passengers, 100 at least may be noticed perusing a book or newspaper, and we are not aware of the existence of any national ophthalmic disease. Let us now point out the best method of reading in railway carriages. In order to prevent the vibrations of the carriages to the arms and book, do not rest the elbows on solid parts of the carriage, but hold the book or paper in both hands and support it by muscular power. The arms thus disposed will impart an elasticity and aplomb to the volume, while the head, by being balanced on the neck, or at least not pressed or rested against the solid sides of the compartment, is equally free from communicating vibration to the frame. Chess playing and card playing. Chess playing is a pleasant contrivance for whiling away the tedium of the journey with those who are fond of the diversion. But the danger is in becoming too much absorbed in the game, as in the case of 2 players who intended to alight at Bath, but traveled on to Exeter. Card playing, although somewhat difficult of accomplishment, is a pleasant pastime among friends, but beware of entering into this amusement with strangers. It is well known that a class of swindlers known as card sharpers exist, who live by traveling in railway carriages and taking in the unwary. When therefore you are pressed to take a hand or to select a card, or play a part in the performance of some sleight of hand business, have nothing to do with it. you are sure to be swindled out of your money and have no remedy. Smoking. Although smoking is prohibited ordinarily upon railways, some lines have certain smoking carriages provided where the enjoyment may be indulged in without giving offense to others. He, therefore, who is inconsolable on the journey in the absence of his beloved weed, should take care to acquaint himself with the fact whether there are smoking carriages or not. We believe that on certain occasions the stringency of the prohibition is relaxed, and we were once present at the arrival of a train from Doncaster during race time, which train had more the odor of a divan than anything else, and every other passenger who alighted therefrom held between his lips a partially consumed cigar. Musing, etc. Railway traveling affords a favorable opportunity for musing and reflecting, combined with that delightful occupation known as building castles in the air. Trivial as it may appear, we yet think it worth recording that the noise made by the train in its journey will accommodate itself to any tune, whether lively or sad, so that if a passenger choose to hum any of his favorite airs, he will find an accompaniment ready-made. Another source of amusement is reckoning the distance performed with the time occupied in the performance. To ascertain the distance traveled, the posts and gradients placed along the line must be observed. These are situated at intervals of 1/4 of a mile from each other. Those on the left-hand side to the country show the mileage from the metropolis. Those on the right-hand side, the distance from the provincial terminus. Sleep. The last resource of the tired and the weary readily visits the eyes of some railway travelers, while to others it comes not, woo it as they may. The head reclines, the lids are closed, the body is disposed in the most favorable manner, but the attempt to obtain slumber is totally unsuccessful. Some persons, on the other hand, appear to sleep as well in the compartment of a railway carriage as they would on their own domestic couch. We were once traveling by the mail train from London to Manchester. The train was on the point of starting, and we had made up our mind that we should have to perform the journey alone. At that moment a tall, bulky person entered, and without looking either to the right or left, made for the further corner of the carriage. By the aid of a portmanteau and sundry packages, he raised a structure between the two seats of the same height as the seats themselves. He then swathed his body with a capacious shepherd's plaid. After that, he removed his hat and placed on his head a cap which fitted close to the skull and came down over the ears. Then he took his seat, or rather assumed a recumbent position across the two seats, and finally he tucked himself with sundry rugs and so fell asleep. From that moment we saw nothing more of our fellow traveler than the tip of his nose. From that moment we heard no other sound than a bassoon-like accompaniment to the rattling of the train. In fact, a continuous and sustained snore. When we arrived within a few miles of Manchester, the sleeper awoke as if by instinct, shook himself together, removed his rugs and plaid and cap, collected his parcels, and looked at us. We hereupon ventured to remark that he had had a nice nap, to which he replied that he always made a practice of enjoying his night's rest on the railway, and whenever it was practicable he preferred traveling by night, Firstly, because he thereby gained time. Secondly, because he thereby saved the expense of a bed at a hotel. And thirdly, because he stood one chance the less of being crippled or killed by the agency of a pair of damp sheets. We then ventured to ask what secret means he employed to ensure such an uninterrupted slumber such as we had witnessed. He stared at us for a few seconds in astonishment, and then said, "Sir, I make up my mind to do it. And let me tell you that it is as easy to make up your mind and to sleep accordingly as it is to determine upon eating your dinner and to eat it. Halloo, here we are." With these words he cut short the colloquy, gathered up his packages, and vanished. We set this remarkable man down as a traveling member of a philosophical society, or a political economist at least, but we afterwards learned that he was the representative of a highly respectable button house. Binns, in his entertaining work on sleep, gives a recipe by which sleep may be procured at will, and which is somewhat to the following effect. Dispose yourself comfortably on your right side and place your hand beneath your head. Shut your eyes. Take a long inspiration and then exhale the breath gradually. Repeat this several times, and all the time you are doing so, imagine that you see a spiral wreath of smoke ascending towards the ceiling. If you can abstract your mind effectually and continue it for a few minutes, you will fall asleep. This extraordinary plan has been adopted, it appears, by many persons of eminence and has been approved by them. Another method of producing sleep is to close the eyes and repeat some simple piece of poetry, or count a certain number, say from 1 to 1,000. We mention these matters here because a few hours' sleep frequently prove a great boon to the railway traveler, and if we can suggest any method by which that boon may be secured, these lines will not have been written in vain. Refreshment. On a long journey, refreshment will be needed, and this can be either obtained on the road, or the traveler may be his own purveyor and take it with him. The rule generally is for the train to stop 5 or 10 minutes for the purpose of taking refreshment. In such cases, especially with anything like a heavy train, a rush of passengers is made simultaneously towards the refreshment room, and the counter is besieged by hungry and thirsty applicants, urging their various requests for sandwiches, buns, biscuits, wine, brandy, ale, etc. But inasmuch as there are usually some 200 or 300 persons requiring refreshments, and only about a dozen hands to supply them, it stands to reason that the task of serving out the viands is no easy one, and many are the disappointments accordingly. Let the traveler remember that he has only the short space of 5 or 10 minutes to gain the refreshment counter, to obtain the refreshment, to pay and perhaps receive change, to perform the operation of eating and drinking, and regain the seat in the carriage. It is obvious, therefore, that a person must exercise his utmost ingenuity and energy in order to accomplish this edible feat. Now, in this, as in everything else, a certain amount of tact is necessary to ensure the desired end. When the train is on the point of stopping, mark well the place where the words refreshment room are written up, so that directly the train stops, you may make at once for this place without wasting your time in looking about for it. walk straight to that part of the counter where one of the attendants is stationed, and having, in parliamentary phraseology, caught her eye, declare your wants. But in doing this, be quick and concise. If you desire a basin of soup, never mind the words "a basin of," but simply utter the monosyllable "soup." So with a cup of tea, content yourself with calling out the latter word. A bottle of ale, ale, etc. Call out distinctly and in a loud voice. Have the precise sum ready if you know what it will be, or at any rate tender a small coin. Beware of taking hot refreshments. Whether it be by accident or design, we know not, but certainly the fluids supplied are so excessively hot and so long in forthcoming that it is utterly impossible for a person to swallow them unless his throat be sheathed with iron. Observe also that you should repair to the refreshment room either immediately the train stops or just before it starts again, for during the mid-interval the counter is literally besieged with a crowd of eager applicants, and a person standing behind these and endeavoring to make his wants known through the din of voices and the clatter of plates and cups and saucers has but a very indifferent chance. On the whole, we should advise the railway traveler to take his refreshment with him. A few ham and beef sandwiches, together with a little cold wine or brandy and water, will answer every purpose. And by this means a double advantage will be secured, for a person may partake of his refreshment at any moment he pleases, without being obliged to eat and drink at a particular moment dictated by the railway company. He will also obtain his refreshment at a much more moderate charge, and further, he will have the interval to stretch his legs in, and to breathe a little fresh air, which he will find far more advantageous than being huddled and pushed about amidst a hungry and impatient crowd. Every person who is about to travel a long distance and is desirous of setting out with a feeling of comfort and satisfaction should take care to provide suitably for the wants of the inner man. And this is especially to be observed if the hour of departure be early in the morning, and that morning a cold and raw one. In the ordinary course of life, every one recognizes the advisability of laying a good foundation, as it is familiarly termed, or in other words, making a breakfast so hearty and substantial as shall not only afford nourishment to the frame for some hours, but shall form an appropriate basis for the various kinds of sustenance introduced into the stomach during the subsequent portions of the day. This is a precaution which railway travelers neglect more than any other. The coming journey produces with many persons a state of nervousness and anxiety, which deprives them of their appetite, so that after swallowing 2 or 3 mouthfuls of food and half a cup of tea, they quit the table, and with this meager provision they start for the station. By the time a few miles of the journey are accomplished, the appetite recovers itself, and the slighted repast is recalled to the mind with feelings of regret and vain desire. Under such circumstances, persons should force themselves to make a vigorous attack on the viands, and as according to the French proverb, the appetite comes in eating, the meal commenced with indifference may be continued with relish and ended with gratification. At whatever time of the day the journey is to be accomplished, the traveler will be doing a wise thing to take some refreshment just previous to starting. Marking carriage for recognition. When you leave a carriage during the journey, it is essential that you should be able to recognize it again on the instant. To facilitate this, every carriage door has the number placed on the inside of it. But although this assists a person to find his carriage, it is not all that is required. We suggest that a rug or shawl of red, or some other conspicuous color, should be thrown across the carriage door so that it may be seen at a distance and may be at once regained without rushing from carriage to carriage to ascertain the number or to take mental photographs of the passengers. Changing carriages. If the carriage in which you are is from any cause uncomfortable, you should get out of it at the first station and enter another. This is sometimes absolutely necessary owing to the misconduct of other passengers, and it is infinitely better to leave them to themselves than to attempt to argue the matter with them. If you wish to change from an inferior to a superior class, the plan is to speak to the guard, and he will have your ticket changed at the station, and the excess of fare will be charged for from the new starting point. But if you change your class without consulting the guard, you will be charged the excess of fare for the whole journey. While we are upon this subject, we may observe that persons are sometimes placed by the railway servants in a superior class carriage when they have a ticket for an inferior one. In such a case, it will be well to direct the attention of the occupants of the carriage to the fact, so that you may be spared the annoyance and the overcharge which will be asked for on arriving at the terminus. Care of railway ticket. The railway ticket should be guarded with care, as it is demanded at the end of the journey, and those who cannot produce it are compelled to pay again. It is useless to asseverate that you have paid and have lost your ticket. Such an assertion will not be heeded in the least. The simple fact of your not being able to produce it is regarded as the most certain sign of your not having paid, and therefore pay you must. A ticket may be also demanded during any part of the journey. The object, therefore, is to have it always safe and always handy. A porte-monnaie or pocketbook is perhaps the best receptacle, or the inside of the left-hand glove. The worst place is certainly the pocket, where money and other things are ordinarily kept, on withdrawing which the ticket may be withdrawn too, and thus be lost. Looking out for station. If it is your intention to alight at some intermediate station, you must keep a sharp lookout to prevent being carried beyond it. Observe that the name of the station appears just before you reach it and just after you pass it, not at the station itself. When a train is about to stop, there is a perceptible lessening of speed, so that it is always easy enough to direct your eye to the left side of the line and note the name of the station. True, the porters sometimes call out the name of the place, but this they do so hurriedly and in such a curious and varied dialect that it is next to impossible to gather their meaning. For instance, when the train stops at Rochdale, you will hear the name called out as Rockdal, Rushdal, Roochdal, Rouchdal, and anything but what accords with your preconceived notion of the pronunciation of the name of the place. And thus it is with numerous other places, the name being pronounced in accordance with the patois of the place itself, and not agreeably to the rules of Walker. Ventilation and drafts. In regulating the atmosphere of the railway carriage, the two main objects, of course, are to secure good ventilation and to prevent drafts. This is easily done in first-class carriages, but not so easily in the inferior classes. The doors of the carriages are usually fitted with a sort of slide, which may be opened or closed as occasion demands, and which in winter-time will be found to admit sufficient air without necessitating the opening of the window. But in summer-time, when it is considered necessary to open the windows, one only should be opened, and the one opposite the quarter in which the wind blows. The opening of both windows occasions a draught, which even in the warmest weather is apt to give persons colds, sore throats, stiff necks, etc. In passing through tunnels, the windows should always be closed, as the air there is of the worst description. When persons will insist upon having both windows down, the best plan is to leave that carriage and enter another. But if this cannot be done, then keep the head, throat, and mouth covered, the only measures that can well be taken. Caution against looking out of window. Some persons, when traveling by railway, have a knack of continually thrusting their heads out the window. Nothing can be more dangerous than this, and numerous are the accidents that have resulted in consequence. The proper place for the head is inside, not outside the carriage, and so long as it is kept there, the chances are that it will remain whole. Caution against standing by the door. Children of all ages are frequently suffered by their parents to lounge against the door, which, if not properly fastened, is liable to give way to the pressure and hurl the child foremost on the rails. Generally speaking, the door is fastened securely, but occasionally it is not, and this happening occasionally is sufficient evidence of insecurity. Caution in passing through tunnels. Male passengers have sometimes been assaulted and robbed, and females insulted, in passing through tunnels, and this has been most frequently the case when there have been only two occupants in the carriage. In going through a tunnel, therefore, it is always as well to have the hands and arms ready disposed for defense, so that in the event of an attack, the assailant may be instantly beaten back or restrained. Asking information. When a railway traveler wishes to glean any information, he should not be afraid of asking his fellow passengers. Among the occupants of the carriage, there is sure to be at least one person who can answer the question put, and persons from whom information is sought usually feel complimented rather than annoyed. And yet there are persons of that reticent disposition who would rather run the risk of passing the station they desire to alight at than ask anyone respecting it. And with that sound advice, I think we'll end this evening's reading from the Railway Traveler's Handy Book, which once again has given us a remarkable amount of what seems to be very obvious information in this day and age, but was probably entirely new in 1862. I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to read this work for yourself, you'll find a link to a free PDF from the Internet Archive in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com, It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.